Hello, I'm Nick Holt, editor at Automotive Manufacturing Solutions, and welcome to our first AMS live stream. Our topic for this session are strategies for greener production. Firstly, I'd like to thank our partner for this live stream, ArcelorMittal. The company is a major supplier for the automotive industry and has recently launched an ambitious roadmap for carbon reduction in its steel production, but we'll hear more about that later on. So I'd like to introduce our special guests for this session. We have Matthias Wilkstrom, Head of Global Scania Production System Office at Scania, and Hugo de Gama Campos, Manager for Sustainable Development at ArcelorMittal Europe Flat Products. And we'll be hearing from both of those two a little later on. First of all, just to give some context to the topic of sustainable production, the push to reduce carbon emissions and the kind of environmental footprint of the automotive industry goes beyond just building electric cars. And something we've seen from the people we speak to on a regular basis, the OEMs and the tier suppliers, developing a sustainable production operation across the entire supply chain is now a key factor in any OEM or tier supplier environmental strategy. And with stricter environmental regulations, there's now greater scrutiny of the production supply chain. So there's been some major initiatives in terms of recycling and renewable energy to bring the industry into line. They're not new. Recycling and renewables are not new, but I think the push at the minute is to really lower the carbon emissions, and the programs that we're seeing are extremely ambitious. And similarly, with the advent of electric vehicles, that throws additional challenges in there. But what we're generally seeing across the board is a need for an integrated approach for sort of total lifecycle and TCO decisions that are being made across the value chain. And it's that sort of joined up strategy and pressure that we want to discuss today with our guests. So on the topic of sustainable production, we've just recently published our digital environment and sustainability edition. And this covers all the sort of key topics really. We've looked at them in some depth with kind of application and case study approach to it. And so again, mentioned recycling there, some really big initiatives like closed loop. But one of the things that was kind of thrown up, and I think has been in the media quite a lot, is how to recycle EV batteries. And interestingly, they do throw up a number of challenges that are being looked at and dealt with. And we cover that here, looking at the costs, the components, the processes, the viability of it, and the challenges of changing chemistries, designs, and materials in batteries as they develop. That poses then for the recycling side to keep up. And similarly with recycling, we're familiar to some greater or lesser extent with steel and aluminium, but vehicle interiors are now seeing a whole raft of recyclable materials that are available for designers to use when they're creating the interior of the vehicle. And they are quite materially, they're quite complex. The requirements for the kind of driver UX, the touch, the feel, the smell, everything, the durability, has to still maintain the same standards as the normal materials that have been used for a long time. But there are a number of interesting opportunities out there and technologies that are being used. Very sustainable plastic bottles and fishing nets. So if you want to see how a Jaguar gets those into the seat covers, have a look at the digital edition on our website. And to achieve all of this, you have to power it. And renewables, again, are not a new technology, but the scale of renewable application in automotive manufacturing is increasing. Some pictures here of the Chattanooga solar park, which is from a few years back now. But this kind of gives an indication of what's at. So we're looking at solar, wind, and biomass. In this edition, we've taken a particular look at solar and seeing how the OEMs are applying it and the benefits they're getting from that. So again, have a look at our digital and sustainability digital edition on the website at automotivemanufacturingsolutions.com and see what you think. And there should be a link actually appearing in the chat box that you can click onto if you'd like to have a look at that. So just to quickly introduce our two panelists today. we have with us Matthias Wilkström from Scania. Matthias has been active in the truck industry since 2002, and he's currently part of the production and logistics management team at Scania, and responsible for the development of the Scania production system. This is part of the company's strategy to deploy process and sustainability coordination across its operations. So what I'll do now is I'll hand over to Matthias to begin his presentation. What I'd like to encourage all of you watching with us today is we have a Q&A session later on, and we'd really like to hear your thoughts and comments and questions on this topic. So if you've got questions for Matthias and Hugo for later, please put those to us, and we'll pick them up after both the sessions are done. So with that, I'll hand over to Matthias to begin his presentation.
Thank you, Nick. I hope you can hear me now.
Yeah, I can hear you, Matthias. You can.
Good. Now we're just waiting for the full screen here to arrive. So, hello everybody. My name is Matthias Wikström. I'm really pleased to have the possibility to come to this webinar and talk about sustainability from a planet perspective and how that's impact production at Scania. And I will speak for approximately 50 minutes. And after that, there will be possibilities, of course, to ask more detailed questions. Before I go on, I just have to comment on the truck in the background here. It's a really milestone in the sustainability journey of Scania, since it's the first full electrical truck. We launched that earlier this year, and it will be really interesting how that will be accepted by the market. Good. Then looking into what I will present today, I will start a little bit about the production system and how that connects to sustainability and the strategy deployment process, and why I think that's important when you're on your sustainability journey. Then I will go a little bit more into the process part of it and how sustainability affects process at production. And of course, also how the product is affected by a sustainability journey. I will end up just a little short, zooming out a little bit, challenges as an established company like Scania is. What is the challenges for us moving forward in this disruptive technologies that we're seeing in front of us, or that we also are working with just at the moment. Okay, starting with a production system, and here it's visualized by the Scania production system, and that of course is something that is pretty common in the automobile industry, and it's influenced heavily, of course, by Toyota and Lean. What I think it's important to see here is on the right side, something that we at Scania call the thinking model, how we connect our results, our methods, principles, and core values. Since the production systems more or less is questioned how to integrate sustainability or new initiatives into it. I used to present it like this. On the left side, we have, of course, results. And if you don't have good results in your daily operations, you move up a little bit to the methods and you change the method. And so if you still don't get the right results, you move on to principles and core values. And somewhere in the top, you have a mission and a vision that guides your operational activities. On the same way, on the right side, here where we look at our strategy deployment process, where of course you're also guided by the same, hopefully, mission and vision statement that goes down into, and here of course there will be a little bit differences. You might not call it strategy focus area, but you usually have a 5+ or 10+ year plan. You have maybe a little bit midterm 2 to 3 years, and then you look into the strategic activities that will look into 1 to 2 years. That should of course also give you a result. Here I like to place the production systems, the operational part on the left side. And on the right side, you have initiatives like sustainability, e-mobility, or circular economy. And normally you start by, if you take sustainability as an example, You maybe have a sustainability general, or you actually have a sustainability department at your company. But I think it's extremely important that initiatives or strategic focus like sustainability goes down the strategic deployment process and then becomes something on the left side. It has to become part of your DNA. It has to be part of the decision models. It has to be part of the methods and principles that guides the operational activities. You have to do that transformation to succeed in a in the sustainability journey. If you don't do that, if you don't able to get those kind of decision models into your everyday operation, you will, I believe, you will long time fail. Okay, if I then move on into the process, and I think this is just a couple of the focuses that we have at Scania, and I think this is not unique for Scania. You of course look at CO2, energy use, waste, and water, and that is, if I look at other companies, it's pretty much what they're looking at also, depending of course what kind of business you have. What I like to emphasize here is like it is really important that you have a long-term vision, like for CO2, and then you're able to break it down to short-term actions and targets. And unfortunately, I usually see a lot of companies that sets up a long-term vision, like, oh, we should be CO2 neutral in 2035 or 2050 or something like that, in a very distant future when no one in the management team will be left. But I don't really see them backing it up with short-term actions and proof that they're moving into this direction. And don't misinterpret me now. It's of course very good to have a long-term vision, but if you cannot back it up with short-term actions that you can show that you move in that direction, for me, it's not worth anything. Looking into waste, I think that is also pretty straightforward. I get the question sometimes, is that a matter of cost or is it a matter of something else? And I would say I don't see it as a problem with investments or cost. It's more getting waste up to the same level as other KPIs that you're measuring in your daily operation. If you're able to break down the long-term target into short-term targets, then you will be able to move in a good direction with this question as well. And I think when you start with waste, you usually look on the lower side here of the waste ladder, energy recovery to landfill, and from a production and logistic point of view, that is then you have the whole scope in your own hands, and it's pretty straightforward. You just have to break it down, and it fits in your normal linear model. However, if you move up a little bit to reuse and recycling, I think it gets more interesting, because here you start to talk about circular economy. And then the circular economy business model does not really goes hand in hand with the linear one. Take, for example, packaging. Most of us have some kind of packaging, and you start to get an ambition that you should have maybe, okay, I push it to my suppliers that they have to have recyclable packaging. Then the idea to go to, okay, but I have a lot of recycled material that we could use as a resource here. Why don't we close the loop? But then usually inside a company, you have to go outside your functional responsibility, and you end up with purchase. And in purchase in this way, if you don't have, and here I have to emphasize, it's extremely important that you have a corporate strategy for those kind of missions, because if you end up with two functions having different KPIs, controlling where you like to go with sustainability or circular business, you will also fail. And if you come into the reuse one, if you look at the packaging here, in a linear model, from a purchase point of view, you probably like to have a couple of different suppliers to choose one and take the ones that is best for the moment. In the circular business model, you like to have one partner that you have a long-term commitment with, and that is scary. Then you have to start building trust, and it's totally different from what you have done before. So you have to be aware of these problems and this way of looking at it. So also here again, I emphasize the importance of having a good strategy plan about this long-term vision for the whole company. If I move on a little bit, show you these pictures. Maybe some of you in the audience has picked up that I think it was 1 or 2 weeks ago, we said that we are to build a battery factory at Scania. And I can be honest with you, actually, if I back the tape 2 or 3 years, 3 years, it was not obvious at all that we should build a battery factory. Actually, it was a lot of discussions about, okay, but we don't know anything about batteries. Why should we do this? We thought about the AAAs and the AAs. That was as much as we knew about batteries. But we actually have to back up. If you remember the first PowerPoint I showed you, you actually have to go up to the mission statement and say, okay, why do we even have production at Scania? What is the value add? What will happen if we stop existing? Who will miss us? And we actually went back to the why we exist, and got a good view on that. It's a question that we didn't have to ask ourselves for the last 30 years. Then the decision to start making batteries was not so hard to take. Also, if you look at the batteries, and I saw Nick was talking a little bit about that, we don't have that much time today, but I think from a production point of view, looking at the product we produce, I think today is around 98% of it is recyclable. However, it's very low value recyclable. If we look into the future now with batteries coming also for the heavy truck industry, we will end up with a pile of gold in the back of the truck. And this will of course be a value stream that will be really interesting to get hold of. And I would say the responsibility in the past for production has been to be part of the production development process as a partner to help R&D to develop things that are good quality and easy to produce, like design for assembly, design for manufacturing. And of course, later on, it all set it up with service. It should be easy to do service on the products. But I think here you can also see it maybe taking one step further. If you want to be part of the value chain that looks into deassembled batteries, we should also then design our products so that should be easy to disassemble. Because if you can do that in a more productive way than the competition, you will have a possibility to make money or make a profit in that value stream as well. Okay, I will move on with, I think this is the last picture I have. Looking at time here. What is this? A heritage. I like to just, for the last one, zoom out a little bit. This is, I think, the biggest benefit and the biggest risk being at a more established company like Scania in a big disruptive technology era. We have been able to build, I think, won the Green Truck Award for the last 4 years. We are really good at building trucks. This is, of course, our strength, but we have to look at our production system, and we have to also have the balance, as I showed that in the beginning, to question what is the knowledge, processes, and methods that we have today that is also relevant for tomorrow. And those who are not relevant, those we have to get rid of. And what we don't have, we have to fill it up with new stuff. I think the companies that are able to do that, they can build on what they have and their strength and incorporate new strength. I think they will be the winners going forward. Okay, thank you. That was all from my side. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Matthias. That was very interesting. We'll chat a bit more later on about some of the points you made there. I'm very interested to follow up on the batteries being trucks full of gold at the back. That's quite a
Yes.
quite an interesting statement on the recycling. But again, some interesting points made there. So we'll come back to you, Matthias, in a few minutes after Hugo's presentation. Hugo has held various positions with ArcelorMittal and is currently the Sustainable Development Manager for the company in Europe for the Flat Products Division. And he works to deliver sustainability solutions to customers such as the automotive manufacturers. And his main focus is on climate change strategy in order to reduce the embedded CO2 footprint in the company's steel products. I know from having looked at the ArcelorMittal roadmap, it's a very ambitious program with some interesting technologies. So I'm going to pass on to Hugo to explain more about the company's position, and then we will have some questions for Hugo and for Matthias later on. So if you have any questions, please drop them into the chat box and we'll pick them up later on. So thanks for that. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Hugo. Are you ready to go?
Yeah, I am ready to go. Thanks very much, Nick. Hopefully you can see my slides in full screen.
Yeah, all good, Hugo. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, thanks again, Nick, for the introduction. I won't spend a lot of time introducing ArcelorMittal or who we are exactly, but suffice to say, we are one of the world's largest steel makers, and I am working in our Europe Flat Products division, and that's the part of the business that's supplying flat steels to the automotive industry. So I've got some slides here which are really aiming to give a sort of brief snapshot of what we're doing to decarbonize steelmaking and to achieve our CO2 reduction targets. But I'll save a lot of the detail for the discussion later on. So the first point I'd like to sort of make is about the benefits of steel, and I think for the AMS audience, this is probably already well known, but we really do believe that steel is the perfect material for a low carbon circular economy, and that's primarily due to three reasons. Firstly, steel is highly recyclable. Its magnetic properties make it extremely easy to sort, and it also has the benefit of not being downcycled, so it maintains its quality properties throughout recycling. Secondly, steel is a really key enabler for other sectors to achieve their own decarbonisation objectives. We often use the example of steel being used in wind towers for wind farms, or for trackers for solar panels. I think it's also well known that advanced high strength steels are contributing to the automotive sector with things like lightweighting, which is contributing to fuel economy and reducing CO2 emissions as a result. And finally, steel also has comparatively low CO2 emissions when compared to other materials. On average, the CO2 footprint of steel is around 2 tons of CO2 per ton of steel. And when you compare that to other materials like aluminium or magnesium, generally, steel has a lower CO2 footprint. But with that said, we do have one major challenge that we need to try and resolve when it comes to steel. The volume of steel that is produced globally is really very large. And that means that we as the steel industry represent a significant share of the global CO2 emissions. So around 8% of global CO2 emissions are attributable to steel making. And I think the transport industry, for reference, is around 20 or 25%. So steel really is quite a big chunk of global CO2. And we as a steel company are fully aware of that. And that's really the reason why we need to decarbonize. So then, if we look in a bit more detail specifically at the automotive sector, what we see with internal combustion engine vehicles today is that around 18% of the CO2 emissions embedded in that vehicle are coming from the materials, and the remaining emissions coming from the use phase, from the car manufacturing and so on, but around 18% today coming from materials, of which steel is a significant portion. As we move sort of towards battery electric vehicles and the situation that Matthias was describing, where we have battery electric vehicles with zero tailpipe emissions, and car manufacturers, securing power purchase agreements for renewable electricity supply in their manufacturing processes, we end up in the future with this scenario where the portion represented by materials is the largest chunk of the life cycle CO2 emissions of a car. And that is a message that we are getting really strongly and really clearly from the OEMs, but also from some of the parts manufacturers and the tier 1 suppliers to the OEMs. So looking then at a bit the sort of source of CO2 emissions in steel making. Steel is a bit unique in the sense that the main source of CO2 is not coming from energy. It's not like a car where the combustion of fossil fuel is resulting in a CO2 emission, or similarly, in the power sector where they're combusting fossil fuels to produce electricity. In steel, the source of CO2 is a result of a chemical reduction. So to make steel, we need iron. And to make iron, we need iron ore, and iron ore is effectively iron oxide, FeO, and we have to remove the oxygen from that iron oxide to produce the iron, and we do that by adding a reductant, and the reductant that we use today, it comes in the form of carbon in coal. So essentially what happens is we add coal into the blast furnace. That produces carbon monoxide. There's then an oxidization process. The carbon monoxide oxidizes with the oxygen in the iron oxide, and the result is CO2. So that chemical reaction is great in a way because we're able to produce iron, which is what we need. But the unintended consequence of that is that CO2 emissions happen as a byproduct. So what most people sort of jump to then is the conclusion that, okay, well, why continue making steel from iron ore? You should make it from recycled sources instead, and then you would avoid those CO2 emissions. The problem we have is that in the steel industry, we enjoy very, very high recycling rates already today. So upwards of 90% recycling rates for steel. Scrap steel is a highly sort of valuable economic resource, and pretty much all scrap that is produced today is already consumed. And we face this situation where the global demand for steel significantly outweighs the availability of scrap. And that means then we have to continue producing steel using iron ore. And our analysts are sort of predicting that the world will continue to need steel from iron ore well into the future. So our strategy team are saying that until sort of the year 2100. So when it comes to achieving sort of climate targets around reaching CO2 neutrality by 2050, it's absolutely clear that the world will continue to need iron ore. So then the sort of conclusion is, well, we have to then find a way of decarbonizing iron making. That then becomes the sort of #1 priority for us as a steel maker. And we have really three ways to decarbonize that iron making process. So the first is what you see in the top there, the clean power vector. So in that way, we can directly reduce the iron ore using hydrogen. So we use a different reductant. We would no longer use carbon, we use hydrogen instead. The trouble with that is that hydrogen also does not occur naturally. You have to produce hydrogen. And there are two ways to do that. One is using natural gas. And of course, if you're using natural gas, then you have a significant CO2 emission from the hydrogen production. The other way to then produce hydrogen is through electrolysis. And you can do that in a CO2-free way if you have sufficient renewable electricity to produce the hydrogen. So that sort of hydrogen reduction is the sort of first technology we have. The second way of doing it is what we at ArcelorMittal describe as circular carbon. And this sort of suite of technology is really focused on carbon capture utilization. So we continue emitting, well, we continue producing CO2, but then we capture that and we can turn that into different products. So one particular technology we have is called Carbolist. So we can capture CO2 and then using a sort of bio-fermentation process, it's a similar process to making beer actually, we can then transform that CO2 into ethanol. And then with that ethanol, we can produce ethylenes and plastics, or even biofuels and things like that. And then finally, there is the sort of more typical sort of carbon capture and storage technology route. So in that sense, we could either produce direct reduced iron using hydrogen, with the hydrogen coming from natural gas, and then we could capture that CO2 as a result of that and store it in geological features like oil fields. Or similarly, we could just continue with the conventional steelmaking route that we follow today, and again capture the CO2 and then store it. But clearly, we know that carbon capture and storage is the sort of less favourable of those three options, because we really see sort of CCS as the solution for sectors that have no other option to abate their CO2. Like I've sort of said, in steel, we really do have these two technology routes where it is possible to produce carbon neutral steel. But we face some challenges in deploying those technologies. But the point I want to make really clearly is that the decarbonisation challenge in steel is not so much a technological one. We know how to produce carbon neutral steel. We're piloting the technologies to do that. The issue is more in the deployment of those technologies in terms of policy and funding. So we like to look at this as a bit of a puzzle, and there are a few pieces that we, speaking as ArcelorMittal now, bring to that puzzle. So firstly, as a company, we're fully committed to the Paris Climate Agreement. We've announced a 2050 carbon neutral target for Europe, and a minus 30% CO2 target by 2030. So we have the commitments in place. We also have a really extensive R&D capability, and from that we have been developing these technologies based on the routes that I described in the previous slide. We also, as part of our strategy, have plans to increase the amount of scrap that we use. But there are some fundamental pieces from this puzzle which are missing. And the first one of those is a bit what I alluded to in the previous slide about having abundant, affordable, clean energy available. Decarbonisation of the steel industry will require significant energy infrastructure investments that need to happen. And then secondly, access to finance is another key enabler. So this transition will cost billions and billions of euros, and we need access to funding, both public funding through things like the European Emissions Trading Scheme Innovation Fund, but also private funding through innovative instruments like green bonds. And then we're also advocating for more of a circular economy approach in policy making. So in the automotive sector, for example, we know that emissions regulation has traditionally mainly focused on tailpipe emissions. But we believe that if the Commission takes more of a sort of circular economy, life cycle based approach to emissions regulation, then that can also help accelerate the transition towards carbon neutrality. And finally, the sort of missing piece is around what we describe as a carbon border adjustment. So the reality today is that steelmakers in Europe have to bear a CO2 cost under the emissions trading scheme, and non-European steelmakers don't. So the idea with a carbon border adjustment is having some protection in place that protects European steelmakers who are bearing that high CO2 cost and investing in breakthrough technologies, and sort of protecting them against imports that don't have to bear that cost. So that's those are my sort of slides in a snapshot, and I'll hand back to you now, Nick.
Thanks, Hugo. that's again highlighting just how complex and challenging some of the sustainability programs are, but a great insight there into what ArcelorMittal do. I'm going to be asking you and Matthias some questions in a minute. Just to let you know that both Matthias and Hugo's presentations, you can download them in the handout section on your little dashboard there. So if you want to take those away with you, you can do. Just a quick flash forward here from our point. We have another AMS live stream planned for December 17th. This one will be focusing on automation, another hot topic. So we have speakers from BMW, Ford, and Symbio Robotics. So I'd be delighted if you join us for those. You can. There should be a link now in the chat box that you can register, or you can go to the website and register there. But yeah, please look at that and be great to join us if you can. Questions. This is a big sort of topic in the sense that interesting things from both sides here. You mentioned, Matthias, a couple of things. One, that almost like the philosophy of the company changing to have this sustainable base to start with, not tacking it on later on, and kind of how that's affecting the thinking and the decision making. And similarly, Hugo, ArcelorMittal knows how to make steel. It's been doing it for a very long time. It's very well versed with the chemistries and the processes. And also talking to you previously to this live stream, I know you were telling me that a lot of the technologies to clean the process up are kind of there, but the implementation of it and the way both companies have large production operations, that is a big challenge. But I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. Starting with you, Matthias, you said that the key issue of changing Scania's production in line with its core values and sustainability. You mentioned that sort of shift in decision-making process and your approach to production. Could you give us some examples, perhaps, in your sort of equipment process operations where that's kind of highlighted?
Yeah, I can take one example that is looking at. We are actually building a total new foundry plant at Scania at the moment. You can question then, of course, why you build a foundry at the moment now with IC, of course, but we see that for the truck industry, for the long haulage, that will still be a product that will be with us for quite some time. But when we look at the sustainability part of it, and of course from a foundry, here we look a lot of into energy and energy consumption. Here we have worked a lot with our internal experts and people at university to create the most energy efficient foundry so far. Actually, it's we have taken that into our decision models when we have bought equipment. We have taken that into the decision models when we like for the total life cycle cost. And that gives us, in the end, a much more sustainable and cheaper product. And just to talk a little bit more about that, I think why we do this, I think to work with sustainability at all for a company, you have to do it if you would like to continue to stay relevant. Who would like to work for a company that does not have this in their decision models, that doesn't look at sustainability as something important? If we don't embrace that and we don't understand that, we will not attract the young talent that we need to attract as a company to survive. So it's that as well, of course. I hope that answers your question a little bit, Mike.
Yes, sorry, yes, it does. Thank you. And it's also hard. I'm going to come back to the adding other competences in a moment with you, if I may. But I just wanted to ask Hugo a question. One of the things we see with suppliers is it's not just producing steel in your instance and giving it to the supplier, your OEM contacts. You kind of work much more in a partnership now with your automotive clients. We see that a lot more. It's a lot closer integration. I mean, in terms of that, I mean, working with your automotive customers, kind of what are the most important measures you would point to in helping them to reduce their carbon emissions and energy related things? I mean, from a steel point of view, how do you support them in that respect?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a ton of work being done on steel applications in automotive, and I don't profess to be the expert in that field, but we have hundreds of R&D researchers who are sort of constantly innovating to produce newer grades of advanced high strength steel that contributes to lightweighting. And that's been going on for many years, for decades, even when we're talking about internal combustion engine vehicles. And I know that we also have newer steels that are being designed specifically for application in battery electric vehicles. So things like battery housings to protect the battery, because as I'm sure you all know far better than me, you have to have something to securely hold the battery and protect it. And then also sort of advanced electrical steels for building semiconductors and things that are highly conductive. So that's on the application side, and indeed not necessarily my area of expertise, but I know there's a huge sort of wealth of innovation going on there. More than on the sort of production side, one of the topics that's coming up more recently is around recycling, and we know that there's a big sort of growth in closed loop recycling, and we're seeing that in typically filtering from other sectors. I don't think in steel we've had necessarily those sort of closed loops for such a long time with OEMs, but yeah, now we're seeing more and more sort of demand for closed loop material recovery. Firstly, in terms of the kind of the steel scrap that is produced in the parts manufacturing. So of course, you have your piece of flat rolled steel, you stamp out the shape you like, a bit like a cookie cutter, and you're left over with the remains. So we have kind of initiatives with car makers to take that back and recycle that. And now where the debate seems to be going is more even on recovering vehicles at end of life. So I think we know that in Europe is sort of a net exporter of steel scrap at the moment, and typically, a lot of cars find themselves, and Matthias, you'll probably know this better than me, I think, but find themselves ending up in North Africa and outside of Europe, going via Turkey and things. So there's a lot of talk in the moment about trying to close that loop and keep those cars within Europe to then be further used as scrap in steelmaking.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, the recycling issue sort of keeps popping up. It's been around with us for a little while. I'll come back to that in a minute, the close thing. I just wanted to return to some points you made, Matthias. You added a foundry. We've read recently that you've brought in battery production, as you were mentioning in your presentation there. Yes. And this kind of seems to chime with a kind of refreshed enthusiasm for vertical integration within large companies, bringing in competences that they haven't had before. I mean, the question really is, are you planning to add more manufacturing competences in these new? Is that going to be a requirement for the new production approaches that you're talking about? And are you going to be insourcing more of that now, or is that just kind of these odd instances, or do you feel that's a definite strategy that works for a vehicle maker?
I think from Scania's point of view, to look at what we should do and not do, that has always been part of our production scope. I know that some other truck companies are looking into other things, but it has always been part of what is actually core, what is strategic for us, and that is based on the customer experience, and that of course will change. What is happening now, Nick, is that we go into a totally different technical change. No one really knows whether it will be fully the tipping point for heavy trucks. We just know that it will come. So what is relevant to have knowledge about today and what will be relevant to have knowledge about tomorrow might not be the same, and that decides what we should manufacture and what we should not manufacture. But I think it's also important to have a balance here, as you said, because we cannot look too much into the new technologies and forget about where we're making the profit in the company today. So it's also about giving acknowledgement of the people that working with the current production system, the current production parts, but at the same time also get new knowledge about what will be relevant for the future. So I know we talked a little bit about this before. I think one of the main challenges, we will of course continue to take in new competence. I think that we have been doing for the last 125 years, otherwise we would not have been here. But I think a key challenge for companies that are a little bit more established is that top management, of course, and middle management, they have made a career in the old, based on the old system and old knowledge. And there you have to have a really open mind, because they have to take the first decision in which direction to go. If you don't have an openness and if you don't have business models that supports this kind of change, then you will fail. Then you will become like a dinosaur. So we talk a lot about knowledge, about bringing on new knowledge in the lower levels or in the engineers. We should re-educate thousands of engineers, but I think the biggest challenge is first start with the top management, because there you have the first bottleneck, I would say. And from Scania's point of view, we are very fortunate now to have a CEO that is extremely interested and extremely keen in driving sustainability, and this makes it much easier. It has not always been the case, and you can really see how much that really influences. Then, of course, that person is not the whole company, but it really influences the direction of the company in the time of period that we're in at the moment.
And I've got another question, just going a little bit deeper with that.
Yeah.
I mean, you're working with startups and new entrants into truck manufacturing. Is that something that you're doing, planning, is in the pipeline? And a similar question actually to Hugo as well, not obviously truck manufacturing, but in terms of ArcelorMittal, are you looking at new entrants to the industry to help support your green production strategies and plans going forward? So sorry, Matthias, if you would answer first, then Hugo feed in as well, please.
Yeah, I think that is key, Nick, that during this, because there's so many possibilities and no one really knows exactly which way it will take. So you have to work with partners, you have to be open to new ways of collaborating. I think one example for that is that we were one of the first to actually go into invest in Northvolt. You know, the company that's setting up the huge battery factory up in north of Sweden. But on the other hand, we're also working with freight companies that more of a solution provider on the other side. So you have to team up here, Nick. You have to know it yourself, but you should also be open for partnership.
Yeah, and I would fully
agree. Is that
agree.
something that ArcelorMittal have been looking at as well?
Yeah, I mean, in exactly the same vein as Matthias described, you know, partnership is key with all of this. I mean, you know, no company can do this on their own. And both partnership in the sense of supply chain partnerships, yeah, indeed, you know, between us and the car makers and the mining companies who supply us, but a bit like you alluded to, Nick, also partnerships with, I wouldn't perhaps call them startups, because, you know, these are big companies in their own right, but the kind of real technical expert companies. So if I take one example, is the carbon capture utilization technology I was describing. There we partnered with a company called LanzaTech, which is from New Zealand, and they're by no means a small company now, because they've pioneered this technology for decarbonizing the steel industry. But you know, without partners like that, for sure, you know, we would be limiting our horizons.
Yeah, Nick, and I think also from the truck industry, we used to maybe selling a truck as a product, but if you don't have that it goes for electrical truck, but also for biogas trucks. If you don't have partnerships there where you can team up with, so that we sell a service that you can also charge your truck or fill it with gas, you will not have a truck to sell. Actually, I can take an example close. My manager got a really nice German electric car here, and after 6 months, he actually handed it in, and he said it was the best product he ever had, but the system behind it was not working. It was impossible to get a good charging structure. He could not go back to the Netherlands during the summer because he had nowhere to charge it. So it's you have to team up with other partners there, because I don't think it's obvious for Scania to build charging stations or building electrical grids to support this. And I think here, also looking at Europe here, here of course legislation comes into this as well. It has to take political decision if we like to be in the forefront. It's not only the companies themselves. This is more of a society one. So you have to be universities together with big companies like Scania, Metal, and also of course the European Union in the end. And okay, which direction should we go here together? Because here we have a global competition as well, of course.
Yeah, it's a thing we're seeing a lot, and this is what's fascinating is the changing relationship between OEMs, tier suppliers, and the suppliers we're seeing coming out. And as you mentioned there, those partnerships are fascinating, because with all due respect to big companies, they can be quite monolithic in their approach to things, but these are happening really fast and are having quite a dramatic impact on how vehicles are made, materials are made, components are made. So we're kind of watching that closely. A question for Matthias. Sorry, Hugo, I'm coming back to you. Having been around a few truck plants in my time,
yes,
it's a bit of a sort of perhaps a basic question, but do you think that the modular approach to building heavy trucks, especially because you see a very modular approach, you have the chassis, the different engine types, axle configurations, cabin configurations that you have with that, and you're very good at packaging those ever increasingly big emission control systems in the exhaust areas as well. But do you think that's created, put you in a better position than, let's say, mass car vehicle makers to make a greener product, essentially, that you can integrate more systems more easily into those vehicles? I know we were talking a bit about earlier on about the battery packs, and obviously fuel cells are now becoming into that. Is that given you, I don't know, an advantage, or is it more straightforward to do that?
Yeah, I hope so. But of course, you have to look at the differences car industry with truck industry. It's all about variation, of course, in the truck industry. But I think the obvious advantage with the modularization is that you can give a product to the end user that is really fits their needs. And we had a lot of discussion about that. What will be the need of the batteries of the future? And we actually believe that also that has to be modularized in a way that it really fits the end consumer. And that was also one of the parts of the decision why we decided to build a battery factory, that we have to have control of this last step and do the sequence modification for the owner. So also from a sustainability point of view, if you have a product that's really designed for your needs, it's then the resource utilization will be better as well. So for sure, modularization, it will be a benefit for us.
Never to leave out a very obvious sort of factor, but electric vehicles. I was going to ask Hugo on this one. We'll come back to you a little bit maybe on that one, the battery factory. But Hugo, I wanted just to ask, the switch to EV production, in some respects, might on the surface seem very simple, but clearly, talking to OEMs and tier suppliers, it is anything but simple. But do you see that having a profound impact on the kind of steels and the kind of production that you're pursuing in terms of volumes and the type of materials?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the actual products you make, indeed, I think there will be a change. The examples I gave earlier in terms of new products coming, like the battery housings, and some modifications to body in white, but by and large, I think generally speaking that would remain largely the same. In terms of production processes, I don't think it's going to have a big impact in terms of how we produce steel. Not at least from a sort of sustainability or CO2 perspective, because the source of CO2 emissions at least is the iron making, right? So it's before we actually start making the steel, in terms of alloying and all the sort of metallurgy we do to make particular grades. So when it comes to decarbonisation, we're focused on the iron making phase, and in that sense, it doesn't matter so much what type of grade you're making. The process sort of iron making will remain the same.
Does customer demand change at all in the sense of what they're asking for in terms of volumes, things like that? Has that shifted at all, or is it kind of pretty much as is?
As far as I'm aware, I think it's more or less as is. I mean, I'm sure my colleagues will have all the stats, and I think if anything, there could be an increase in the amount of steel, by weight that's used in a car with the move to battery electric due to the existence of these new housings.
I mean, yeah, I'm just looking at some of the comments coming in from the audience. A couple of interesting ones here. Someone's mentioning it's slightly kind of off the actual production side of things, but sustainability of procurement and transport I mean, this, I think, again, highlights the challenges down the supply chain. And you see the challenges down the supply chain in terms of availability of product, quality of product, and the further the visibility disappears. And, from the carbon reduction side, that is a big challenge, I'm sure, for both of you as well, because it makes the whole project enormous just to try and control, manage, and audit those kind of things. I don't want to go too much on the logistics side. My colleagues might want to talk about that on another session. And a question here, a comment really here about we've been focusing quite a lot on Europe and the sort of probably where the legislation has the most direct impact, but looking at places for production which are huge in production terms, like China. So I know, Matthias, that the part of the Tratton group, part of the VW group, there's been more investment in, or going to be more investment in the plant at, if I can pronounce this, at Rugao, is it, in China?
Yes.
And yeah, so there's going to be an expansion there of your production footprint. How do you see kind of the managing the sustainability programs and strategies and processes that you're putting in place? We talked about in Europe. Do you see them transferring to other regions like China?
Yeah, if you look at sustainability, of course, you have two things there as well. You have the planet sustainability, but also I think what most people think about when they talk about China is maybe the people sustainability, and that is of course a discussion that we will have to take within our company, how to transform the Scania culture, the respect for the individual, the team spirit together with our Chinese colleagues. I think that will be one huge challenge for us going forward. Looking at the planet point of view, normally when we set up a new factory, it's the machines and everything you can buy today has a really high standard, so I'm not so worried about that part. And here we're looking at the end assembly in the beginning as well, and there is very low environmental footprint on that. So from planet perspective, I think we will cope with that, and I think parts of our when we have factories in other countries, of course, you always fulfill national legislation, but we try to do a little bit more. We try to follow where we have the strongest legislation, and that is then the Scania standard. And we can also sometimes go further than legislation. For example, sound is one of those where we have tougher legislations within our own premises than we have actually legal demands on us. So planet, no. Culture, I think that could be the challenge. And also, as you pointed out, for Scania, this will be it will be one of the first. It's not a joint venture, and there's of course possibilities with that we don't have a partner, we can fully control it, but on the other hand we also then have to adapt to the Chinese way of doing things as well, to have respect for their traditions and their ways of looking at this. So it will be exciting times, I would say.
Well, I appreciate both of you actually more focused. Certainly, I know Hugo more focused on European side of it, but obviously the context is ultimately becomes wider because both global businesses. So, but it's interesting and a challenge. There are a lot of other questions, but we're running out of time now, and I'm sure Chris is waiting to pull the plug on me talking to you. But I just want to say thank you very much for joining us. Really great insight into your businesses, your operations, the approach that you have to this. It's always fascinating to kind of get that look behind the scenes, behind the press release, behind the corporate speech as to how you're implementing some of this stuff. And it's interesting. Environmental sustainability it's been around for years in the sense it's an important topic, but it's interesting the priorities are constantly shifting at the minute, and the challenges for producing the cars, it seems easy, but ultimately the thing that goes on around it is far more challenging. So, and again, thank you for illuminating some of the areas of your business with that. So we'll pass on all the questions that we have to Matthias and Hugo, so they can have a look at them and respond accordingly. I'd like to thank our partner ArcelorMittal for their support for this live stream and for giving us an hour or so with Hugo, much appreciated. You can find all of our broadcast content, previous live streams which we've done on live stream, which we've done over the last few months, podcasts and digital editions in the spotlight section on our AMS website. As we're doing much more digital stuff, much more broadcast stuff, you can keep up to date with it there. And obviously, as we said earlier on, there's a live stream in December on automation, so you can go to the website and register there as well. So with that, I'll say thanks very much to the team behind me for switching me on and off, and thanks to our speakers and our supporters. And we look forward to seeing you at our next live stream in the near future. And thanks very much for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.